The house smelled of lavender and something sour that Helen couldn't quite place, something that clung to the air like an unwelcome guest. She stood in the doorway of her mother's bedroom, watching the rise and fall of that frail chest beneath the hospital blanket the hospice nurse had brought 3 days ago. 78 years of life reduced to this small room with its yellowed curtains and the persistent drip of the bathroom faucet that no one had bothered to fix. Her mother's eyes were closed, but Helen knew she wasn't sleeping. There was a tension in her jaw, a slight furrow between her eyebrows that had been there for as long as Helen could remember. Even in near death, Martha couldn't let go. Helen crossed the room and sat in the chair she'd occupied for the past week, ever since the doctor had said it was time. Time for what exactly he hadn't specified, but they all understood. Time to say goodbye, time to make peace. Time to pretend that the past 40 years of careful distance and polite conversations had been enough. She picked up the book she'd been reading aloud, some mystery novel her mother had never asked for, but hadn't protested against either. The words felt hollow in her mouth, filling the silence with meaningless noise. She'd gotten through 2 chapters yesterday before her mother had turned her head away, a small gesture that somehow held more rejection than any words could. Helen's phone buzzed in her pocket. Her daughter Camilla, probably asking if she should come today. 17, and already so much like Martha, it sometimes hurt to look at her. That same stubborn set to her shoulders, that same way of holding pain close to the chest like a secret. Helen silenced the phone without looking. Her mother's voice cut through the room, rough and barely above a whisper, but with surprising force. She told Helen to stop reading to her like she was a child. Helen closed the book, her thumb marking the page out of habit even though she knew they wouldn't return to it. She said she'd thought her mother was sleeping. Martha's response was cold and matter-of-fact. She hadn't slept properly in 3 months. When she opened her eyes, they were clear and sharp for a moment, the way they'd been when Helen was young, and still believed her mother could see through walls. She mentioned the morphine in the drawer, the bottle the nurse had left behind. Helen had seen it, the small bottle with its careful instructions, its promise of easier days. She hadn't touched it. Some part of her, the part that was still 12 years old and desperate for approval, wanted her mother alert, present, even if that presence came with pain. Helen asked if she was hurting. Martha turned her head toward the window where afternoon light struggled through the dirty glass. Her answer hit Helen like a physical blow. She'd been hurting for 40 years. The morphine wouldn't touch that kind of pain. The words settled between them like dust. Helen had learned long ago not to push, not to ask the questions that formed behind her teeth. Her mother's silences were fortified walls, built with precision and maintained with vigilance. But something in the air felt different today, unstable, as if those walls might finally be crumbling. Martha mentioned that Robert had called yesterday. She hadn't answered. Helen's hands tightened on the book. Her father, Robert, the man who'd left when Helen was 8, who sent birthday cards with increasingly generic messages until he stopped sending them at all, who'd remarried, had other children, built a whole separate life 2 states away, as if erasing the first one. Helen asked why he would call now after all these years. Martha's response was bitter. Because she was dying, she supposed. People like to clear their consciences before the end. Her laugh was more breath than sound, hollow and defeated, as if a phone call could change anything after 3 decades. Helen wanted to ask what needed changing, what exactly had broken so thoroughly that 30 years couldn't mend it. But she knew better. This was how they communicated, in fragments and implications, in what wasn't said more than what was. The faucet dripped. A car passed outside. Her mother's breathing grew labored, and Helen watched her struggle with it, that fierce pride refusing to ask for help even now. She stood and adjusted the pillows, her hands gentle despite the anger she couldn't quite name simmering beneath her ribs. Then Martha said something that made Helen's heart stop. There was something she needed to tell her, before it was too late. Helen sat back down, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. In all her 46 years, her mother had never prefaced anything with those words. Martha didn't confess or explain or ask for understanding. She stated facts and expected acceptance. Helen started to say she didn't have to do this, but Martha cut her off. She did have to. Her hand moved across the blanket, trembling slightly, and Helen found herself taking it. The skin was paper-thin, cool, so different from the strong hands she remembered, the ones that had braided her hair and signed permission slips and pushed her away with equal efficiency. Martha's voice broke as she spoke. She should have told Helen 30 years ago. She should have told her the day she turned 18. She should have told her 1,000 times, but she'd been afraid. The words sounded wrong in her mother's mouth. Martha had never been afraid, or at least had never admitted to it. She was the woman who'd raised Helen alone, who'd worked 2 jobs and never complained, who'd built a fortress of independence and self-sufficiency that nothing could penetrate. Helen asked what she'd been afraid of. Martha closed her eyes again and a single tear escaped, sliding down her temple into her gray hair. Helen watched it, mesmerized, this crack in the armor she'd never thought could break. Martha whispered 3 things that would haunt Helen forever. She was afraid Helen would hate her, afraid she'd finally understand why Robert had left, afraid she'd see Martha the way Martha saw herself. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Helen wanted to pull her hand away, to stand up and leave, to protect herself from whatever was coming. But she stayed, her fingers wrapped around her mother's, waiting for the truth that had been 40 years in the making. The silence stretched until Helen thought she might suffocate from it. Her mother's chest rose and fell with effort, each breath a small battle. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn, the mundane sound absurdly loud against the weight of what hung between them. When Martha finally spoke, her voice was so quiet Helen had to lean closer. She told Helen that Robert hadn't just left. She had made him go. Helen pulled back instinctively, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. She asked what her mother meant. Martha's confession came slowly, painfully. She'd told Robert to leave. She'd packed his things while he was at work. She'd changed the locks. She'd threatened him in ways that didn't matter anymore, except that they did. He'd left because she'd given him no choice. The story Helen had carried her entire life, the narrative she'd built brick by brick to make sense of the abandonment, began to crack. Her father, the villain. Her mother, the victim. Herself, the collateral damage. It had been simple, clean, something she could understand even if she couldn't forgive. Helen demanded to know why. The word came out harder than she'd intended. Martha opened her eyes, and in them Helen saw something she'd never seen before. A kind of raw desperation that made her mother look suddenly young, or perhaps just human in a way she'd never allowed herself to be. Martha's answer was simple and devastating. Robert had found out something, and she couldn't let him stay knowing what he knew. Helen stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. Her hands were shaking. She told her mother she wasn't making sense. Found out what? What secret could be so terrible that it had destroyed their entire family? Martha begged Helen to sit down. There was something in her mother's tone, not quite begging but close enough, that made Helen sink back into the chair. She thought about Camilla, about all the time she'd told her daughter that honesty was the foundation of everything, that secrets destroyed more than they protected. The hypocrisy burned. Martha reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, and Helen helped her drink, this small act of care feeling both intimate and terrible. Some of the water dribbled down Martha's chin, and Helen wiped it away with the edge of the blanket. When Martha began speaking again, her voice was stronger, as if the decision to finally tell the truth had given her temporary strength. She told Helen about working at the textile factory downtown when she was 23, the one that had closed in the 90s. Robert had worked there too, in management. That's how they'd met. Helen knew this story. Her mother had told her once, years ago, a brief mention of meeting at work. Nothing romantic or detailed, just a fact. But there was more to the story, Martha continued. There had been another man there, Daniel. He'd worked on the floor with her, running one of the big machines. He was married with 2 little boys. Martha paused, her eyes fixed on something Helen couldn't see, something decades past. She and Daniel had started talking during breaks. Nothing inappropriate at first, just talk. He was funny, kind. His wife was sick with cancer, and he was so tired all the time, carrying everything alone. Helen felt her stomach tighten. She knew where this was going, could see the shape of it forming like storm clouds on a horizon. Martha spoke quickly now, as if speed could minimize the impact. It had happened only once. One time, during a late shift when everyone else had gone home. It was stupid, reckless, the kind of thing you do when you're lonely and scared and 23 years old and you don't yet understand that one moment can define everything that comes after. The lawnmower stopped outside. In the sudden quiet, Helen could hear her own pulse. Martha continued with the details that would reshape Helen's entire understanding of herself. She and Robert had been dating for 6 months. They were talking about getting married. He was safe, stable, everything Martha thought she wanted. Her hand found Helen's again, gripping it with surprising strength. 2 months after that night with Daniel, Martha discovered she was pregnant. The room tilted. Helen heard the words, understood them individually, but couldn't quite make them cohere into meaning. Pregnant. 2 months later. After the man named Daniel. The math was simple, brutal. Helen tried to speak, but couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too massive to voice. Martha said the words that would change everything. Robert isn't your biological father. Daniel is. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Helen stood again, this time walking to the window, her back to her mother. Her reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, someone whose entire history had just been rewritten. 46 years of identity, of understanding who she was and where she came from, dissolved in a single sentence. Helen asked, her voice sounding distant to her own ears, when Robert had found out. Martha's voice broke as she explained. Helen had been 8 years old. They'd been married for 9 years. Martha had convinced herself it didn't matter, that Robert was Helen's father in every way that counted. But Helen had started looking more like Daniel as she got older. The same eyes, the same mouth. One day, Robert had simply looked at Helen, and Martha watched him see it, watched it all click into place. He'd confronted her that night after Helen went to bed. Martha couldn't lie, not when he was looking at her like that. So she'd told him everything. Helen pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She understood now. Her mother had made Robert leave. Martha's next words were almost inaudible. Robert had wanted to stay. He'd insisted that Helen was his daughter regardless, that 9 years of raising her meant more than biology. But Martha couldn't let him. She couldn't watch him pretend every day, couldn't see that knowledge in his eyes every time he looked at Helen. Martha's breathing grew ragged as she made her final confession. She'd thought it would be easier if Helen hated Robert for leaving than if she knew the truth. Helen turned around, tears on her face, though she didn't remember starting to cry. She asked the question that cut through all the years of lies. Easier for who? Easier for her mother. Martha flinched as if struck. Her answer was raw and honest in a way she'd never been before. Yes, easier for herself. She was a coward, she admitted. She'd been a coward for 40 years. Helen didn't go home that night. She couldn't face Camilla, couldn't walk into her own house and pretend that the foundation beneath her feet was still solid. Instead, she drove, no destination in mind, just movement, the city lights blurring past her windows like tears. She ended up at the old factory, the one her mother had mentioned, though it wasn't a factory anymore. Someone had converted it into loft apartments, trendy and expensive, nothing like the industrial space it had once been. Helen sat in her car across the street, staring at the renovated brick, trying to imagine her mother young, trying to imagine this Daniel, this man whose blood ran through her veins, but whose face she couldn't conjure. Her phone had been buzzing for hours. Camilla, worried, her brother Marcus, who'd driven in from a city 2 states away yesterday and was probably at the house now, wondering where she was. The hospice nurse, maybe, checking in. Helen silenced it all. The truth sat in her chest like a stone. Robert, the man she'd spent 30 years resenting, hadn't abandoned her. He'd been pushed away, exiled for the crime of discovering a lie. And she'd been the weapon Martha used to keep him gone, the living proof of betrayal that made reconciliation impossible. Helen thought about all the times she could have reached out to Robert, all the years she could have tried to rebuild what had been broken. But she'd been too proud, too hurt, carrying her mother's anger as if it were her own. He'd sent those birthday cards, those awkward attempts at connection, and she'd thrown them away unopened after the first few. She'd made him into a villain because it was easier than being confused, easier than living in the grey space where nobody was entirely right or entirely wrong. Her phone lit up with Marcus's name. She answered this time. Marcus's voice was tight with worry. He asked where she was. Helen told him she was fine, that she just needed to drive. Marcus explained that the nurse had called. Their mother was asking for Helen. He paused, struggling with the words, then told her that Martha didn't have much time. She needed to come back. Helen closed her eyes and asked if their mother had told him the truth. Marcus asked what she meant. Confusion clear in his voice. So Marcus didn't know. This secret had been reserved for her alone. This final gift of truth wrapped in 40 years of silence. She wondered if her mother planned to take it to the grave otherwise, if Helen had been the only one deemed worthy or necessary to know. Helen told him she'd be there soon and hung up before he could ask more questions. She drove back slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods she'd known all her life, past the school where she'd learned to read, past the church where she'd made her first communion, Robert sitting in the third pew with a camera, smiling like she was the center of the universe, past the park where he'd taught her to ride a bike, running alongside her with his hand on the seat until she was steady enough to go alone. The memories were different now, weighted with new meaning. Every moment of her childhood had to be re-examined, reinterpreted. What had been loss was actually sacrifice. What had been abandonment was actually exile. And her mother, the woman she'd admired for her strength and independence, had built that strength on a foundation of lies. When Helen arrived back at the house, Marcus was sitting on the porch smoking a cigarette, even though he'd quit 5 years ago. He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. He told her that Martha kept asking for Helen, wouldn't say why, just that she needed to talk to her. Helen sat down beside him, and he offered her the cigarette. She took it, drawing the smoke into her lungs for the first time in 20 years. It tasted like ash and memory. She started to tell Marcus what their mother had revealed, then stopped. How did you tell your brother that your shared history was actually not shared at all? That you'd been living parallel lives without knowing it? Marcus asked what their mother had told her, and there was something in his voice, a kind of knowing that made Helen look at him sharply. She realized then that he already knew. He nodded slowly and explained. He'd found out 3 years ago through hospital records when Martha had the first cancer scare. As her emergency contact, he'd had access to everything, including her medical history, including the blood type information that didn't match with their father's and Helen's. He took the cigarette back, his hand trembling slightly. He'd confronted Martha about it, and she'd begged him not to tell Helen. She'd said it would destroy what little peace Helen had managed to find. Helen felt her anger return, hot and sharp. Everyone had known but her. Everyone had been protecting her from the truth like she was a child. Marcus corrected her gently. Not everyone. Just him and their mother. He turned to face her fully. Martha had been wrong to keep it from Helen, he agreed. But she'd also been terrified. She'd been terrified Helen's whole life that she'd find out and hate her. Helen spoke the truth before she could stop herself. She did hate her mother. The words hung in the cool night air like an accusation. She hated her for lying. She hated her for pushing Robert away. She hated her for making Helen complicit in her fear. Marcus acknowledged her pain. He understood, but then he offered her something to consider. Their mother was dying, and hate was heavy enough to carry when someone was alive. Once they were gone, it became unbearable. They sat in silence for a long time, two people trying to figure out how to exist in the aftermath of revelation. Finally, Helen stood and asked if Martha was awake. Marcus told her barely. The nurse had given her morphine an hour ago. Helen walked inside, through the familiar hallway with its outdated wallpaper and family photos that now felt like lies, into the bedroom where her mother lay. Martha's eyes opened when Helen entered, and in them was such naked hope and fear that Helen had to look away. Helen told her mother she was there and sat down in the chair she'd been occupying for a week, for a lifetime. Martha reached for her hand, and after a long moment, Helen took it. Martha whispered that there was more. About Daniel, about who he was and where he was. Helen felt her heart constrict. She'd been so focused on the revelation of paternity that she hadn't thought beyond it, hadn't considered that Daniel might be findable, real, alive. Martha's final request was simple but monumental. Daniel needed to know. Before she died, he needed to know he had a daughter. Daniel lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city, in one of those neighborhoods that had seen better days, but still maintained a kind of quiet dignity. Helen sat in her car across the street for 20 minutes before finding the courage to approach, watching the yellow light in the front window, seeing shadows move behind curtains. Her mother had given her the address 3 days ago, along with the morphine-softened story of what had happened after that night at the factory. Daniel's wife had died 6 months later. He'd raised his 2 sons alone, never remarrying, never knowing that somewhere in the same city his 3rd child was growing up with another man's name. Martha had kept tabs on him over the years, in the way people do with their ghosts, knowing where he lived and worked but never approaching, never disturbing the separate life he'd built. Helen had waited until after the funeral to come here. Martha had died 4 days ago, quietly in her sleep, with Helen and Marcus sitting vigil on either side of her bed. The funeral had been small, well attended by neighbors and old colleagues, people who'd known Martha as the strong, independent woman she'd presented to the world. Robert hadn't come, though Helen had called to tell him. He'd thanked her for letting him know, his voice careful and distant, and said he'd already said his goodbyes years ago. That phone call had broken something in Helen. The finality of it, the recognition that some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt no matter how much you wanted to. She'd sat with the phone in her hand for an hour after, thinking about all the conversations they'd never have, all the questions that would remain forever unanswered. Now she stood at Daniel's door, her finger hovering over the doorbell, trying to figure out what you say to a stranger who's also your father. The door opened before she could decide, and a man in his late 60s stood there looking at her with confusion that slowly shifted into something else, something that looked almost like recognition. He asked if he could help her, and Helen saw herself in the shape of his mouth, the line of his jaw. Helen introduced herself. She told him her name was Helen Silver, and watched his face change, watched understanding dawn like a terrible sunrise. She said she thought he'd known her mother, Martha Silver. Daniel's hand tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles white. He spoke her mother's name like a prayer or a curse. Helen delivered the news as gently as she could. Martha had died 4 days ago. Before she did, she'd told Helen something. Her voice caught. She'd said Daniel should know he had a daughter. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel stared at her, his eyes moving across her face as if trying to read a map. Helen stood still, letting him look, letting him see what had been hidden for 46 years. Finally, his voice rough with emotion, he invited her inside. The house was neat but lived in, filled with the comfortable clutter of a long life. Photos on the mantel showed Daniel with 2 men who must be his sons, their families, grandchildren. A whole constellation of people Helen was suddenly impossibly connected to. Daniel gestured to the couch and they sat, the space between them both vast and nothing. He didn't speak for a long time, just looked at her, and Helen let him, understanding somehow that he needed this, needed to reconcile the ghost of one night 46 years ago with the woman sitting in his living room. When he finally spoke, the words came haltingly. He hadn't known. Martha had never told him. After that night, everything had fallen apart. His wife had been dying. He'd been falling apart. What had happened with Martha had been a moment of weakness, of need, of being human in the worst possible way. He'd hated himself for it. When his wife died a few months later, he'd thought it was punishment. He'd deserved to lose her for what he'd done. Helen told him gently that he hadn't known Martha was pregnant. Daniel confirmed this, his voice breaking. If he had known, what would he have done? He didn't know. His wife was gone. He'd had 2 boys to raise alone. Would he have reached out? Would he have tried to be a father to Helen, too? He wanted to think he would have, but he honestly didn't know. Helen understood that uncertainty, that recognition that we never really know what we do in impossible situations until we're in them. She thought about all the choices her mother had made, all the ways Martha had tried to control an uncontrollable situation, to manage the fallout of one night's mistake. Daniel spoke quietly about Martha. He thought she'd loved Helen's biological father, in the way you love someone you can't have, someone who represents everything that went wrong. When he'd see Martha around town over the years, She'd crossed the street to avoid him. He'd thought it was disgust. Maybe it had been just guilt. Helen found herself almost smiling. Probably both, she said. Her mother had been good at carrying guilt, Daniel asked, hesitating, if Martha had had a good life, if she'd been happy. Helen thought about her mother's careful distance, her fortress of independence, her decades of secrets. She admitted she didn't know if Martha had been happy, but she'd been strong. She'd raised Helen alone, worked hard, never complained. Helen stopped, surprised by the emotion rising in her throat. Martha had been doing the best she could with an impossible situation she'd created. Daniel's response was simple and profound. Weren't they all? They sat in the quiet of that shared understanding, two people connected by biology and circumstance, trying to figure out what that meant. Finally, Daniel stood and went to a bookshelf, pulling down a photo album. He showed Helen his sons, her half-brothers, he explained, Michael and Paul. They were good men with families of their own now. He turned pages, revealing children of various ages, her nieces and nephews technically. Helen looked at the faces of strangers who shared her blood, feeling the strangeness and wonder of it. She'd spent her whole life as essentially an only child, Marcus being 15 years younger, and from Martha's second marriage, more like a nephew than a brother. Now suddenly she had an entire family she'd never known existed. Daniel asked carefully if she'd want to meet them. He'd understand if she didn't. It was a lot to process, but they'd want to know she existed. They'd want to know about their sister. Sister. The word settled over Helen like a blanket, warm and terrifying. She thought about Camilla, about how furious her daughter had been when Helen finally told her the truth, how betrayed she'd felt by the family mythology she'd always believed. But Camilla had also said something that had stuck with Helen. Maybe the truth was a gift, even when it hurt. Maybe especially when it hurts. Helen told him she'd like that. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Daniel nodded and said there was no rush. They had time. The thing Martha had run out of. The thing Robert had lost with Helen. The thing that suddenly felt both precious and terrifying in its vastness. Helen had spent 46 years living one story, and now she had to figure out how to live another, how to integrate this new history with the old, how to be both the person she'd been and the person she was discovering herself to be. 6 months later, Helen stood in Robert's driveway, her hands shaking as she held the envelope. It had taken her this long to find the courage, this long to sort through her own feelings enough to approach him with something other than apology or anger. The house was different from what she remembered, though she'd only been here twice, brief visits when she was young and still hoping he'd come back. He'd added a garden, roses climbing up a trellis by the front door. Through the window she could see a woman moving in the kitchen, probably his wife, the one he'd married 10 years after leaving Martha. Robert answered the door himself, and Helen saw him freeze, saw the same shock that Daniel had shown, but mixed with something more complicated, decades of hurt and distance crystallizing in his expression. He spoke her name like a question. Helen greeted him awkwardly, unable to call him Dad after so many years, but his name feeling too formal for what they'd been to each other. She apologized for showing up unannounced. She knew she should have called. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, and they stood on the porch in the afternoon sun. He looked older than she remembered, his hair completely grey now, lines deep around his eyes, but he looked softer too, as if time had worn away some of the sharp edges of pain. He asked how she'd been, and the careful neutrality in his voice made Helen's chest ache. She admitted it was complicated to answer. She stopped, laughed a little at the understatement. Robert told her he'd heard about her mother. He was sorry for her loss. Helen spoke quickly, the words tumbling out. Martha had told her everything before she died, about Daniel, about why Robert had really left, about what Martha had done. Robert's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He acknowledged that he understood. Helen apologized then, 30 years of anger dissolving into understanding. She was sorry she'd never reached out, sorry she'd blamed him, sorry for all the years they'd lost because she hadn't known the truth. Robert's voice was gentle as he responded. He reached out as if to touch her shoulder, but stopped short, his hand falling back to his side. She'd been a child, he reminded her. She wasn't responsible for any of it. Helen protested. She could have tried later when she was older. She could have done something. Robert interrupted her self-recrimination. They all could have done many things differently, but they hadn't, and they couldn't change that now. The question was what they did with the time they had left. Helen held out the envelope, gathering her courage. She explained that she'd been meeting with Daniel, her biological father, and his sons, her half-brothers. They were good people. It had been strange, but good. She paused before continuing. But Robert was her father too. He'd been there for the first 8 years of her life, and those years had mattered. They still mattered. She didn't want to lose that because of what had happened after. Robert took the envelope, his hands steady where hers had trembled. He asked what it was. Helen explained they were photos of Camilla, his granddaughter. She was 17 now, about to graduate high school. She was amazing and stubborn, and wanted to meet him if he wanted to meet her. Tears fell freely down Helen's face now. She knew they couldn't get back what they'd lost. Too much time had passed. But maybe they could start from here. From now. Maybe that could be enough. Robert opened the envelope, pulling out the photos Helen had selected, images of Camilla at various ages, growing from baby to child to teenager. He observed quietly that Camilla had Helen's smile, the one she'd had when she was little before everything got complicated. Helen told him she was trying to find it again, that smile, that version of herself that wasn't carrying so much weight. They stood in silence, two people who'd once been father and daughter trying to figure out what they could be now. Finally, Robert looked up from the photos. He told her he'd like to meet Camilla, and he hesitated, to get to know Helen again if she was willing. Not as the child she'd been, but as the woman she'd become. Helen said she'd like that too. Robert's wife appeared in the doorway, a quiet presence, and Robert introduced them. He told Sandra this was Helen, and he told Helen that Sandra was his wife. Then he said the words that Helen had been waiting 40 years to hear again. "Sandra, this is my daughter. My daughter." The words hung in the air like a gift, like forgiveness, like a door opening after decades of being locked. Sandra smiled, warm and understanding, and Helen understood that Robert had told her everything, that this woman had known the whole complicated truth and had made space for it in their lives. They talked for an hour on that porch, careful at first and then easier, finding their way through the minefield of lost years to something like connection. When Helen finally left, she felt lighter somehow, as if putting down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. She drove home slowly, watching the city pass by, seeing it differently now, seeing possibilities where before there had been only regret. At home, Camilla was in the kitchen making dinner, music playing from her phone. She looked up when Helen came in and asked how it had gone. Helen told her it had gone well, better than she'd expected. Camilla asked if Robert wanted to meet her. Helen confirmed that he did whenever Camilla was ready. Camilla nodded, turning back to the stove. Then she mentioned casually that she'd looked up her half-brothers from Daniel's family. Michael had a daughter her age. She'd messaged her on Instagram. Helen felt her breath catch. She asked if Camilla had really done that. Camilla confirmed she had. She asked if it was okay. She knew everything was weird and complicated, but she thought maybe they didn't have to wait for permission to get to know each other. She looked at her mother directly. Maybe they could do it better than the previous generation had. No offense. Helen laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. No offense taken, she told her daughter. Camilla was right. They should do it better. They shouldn't carry the previous generation's mistakes forward. That night after dinner, Helen sat at her desk and pulled out the box of her mother's things. At the bottom was a letter addressed to Helen in her mother's handwriting, sealed but never sent. Helen opened it with trembling hands and began to read. The letter began with an endearment. "My darling Helen." If she was reading this, Martha was gone, and Helen knew the truth. Martha imagined Helen hated her. She imagined Helen couldn't understand why she'd done what she'd done, kept what she'd kept, destroyed what she'd destroyed. Martha admitted she couldn't understand it either most days. She'd been 23 and terrified, and had made choices that seemed right at the time, but grew wrong with each passing year. By the time she'd realized how wrong they were, it had been too late to fix without breaking everything. She'd thought she was protecting Helen. She'd thought she was protecting Robert. She'd thought she was protecting herself. She'd been wrong about all of it. But Martha wanted Helen to know one thing above all else. Helen had been loved. By Martha, by Robert, by Daniel, though he hadn't known she existed. She'd been loved completely, imperfectly, humanly. They'd all failed her in different ways, but they'd also all tried in their own ways to give her what they thought she needed. Martha wrote that she hoped someday Helen could forgive them all. More than that, she hoped Helen could forgive herself for whatever anger she felt, whatever grief, whatever confusion. Helen had deserved better than the story Martha had written for her. Now it was time for Helen to write a better one for herself. The letter closed with all of Martha's love and all of her regret. Helen folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. Forgiveness, she thought, was a process, not a destination. You didn't arrive at it one day and stay there. You worked toward it, fell away from it, worked toward it again. It was a choice you made over and over, each time a little easier, each time carrying a little less weight. She looked out the window at the darkening sky, thinking about her mother and her father and her other father, about Camilla and Marcus and Michael and Paul, about all the people connected to her through invisible threads of DNA and history and love. They were all doing the best they could with the impossible situations they'd inherited or created. They were all stumbling toward something better, even when they couldn't see the path clearly. And Helen, for the first time in months, felt something like peace with that reality. Tomorrow she would call Robert and set up dinner with him and Camilla. Next week, she would visit Daniel and meet more of his family. Eventually, she would sit down with Marcus and have the conversation they'd been avoiding, about what forgiveness looked like when it was directed at someone who was no longer alive to receive it. But tonight, she would sit here in the quiet of her own home, with her daughter's presence nearby and her mother's letter in her hands, and let herself feel the full weight and wonder of being alive, of being connected, of being imperfectly, completely, courageously human. The end.